120 Australians walked into a command briefing at Long Binh in May of 1966, like they were stepping into somebody else's house. Polite, quiet, already judging the furniture. The room was American to the bone. Fluorescent lights that hummed like insects. A wall fan that pushed warm air around without cooling anything. Coffee that tasted like metal. And at the front, a United States Army colonel stood over a table buried under maps of Phuoc Tuy Province, acetate overlays, grease pencil arrows, and the kind of confidence you get when 500,000 men are behind you. He spoke the way Americans spoke in Vietnam back then. Fast, certain, full of verbs. Sectors, patrol routes, search and destroy perimeters, helicopter insertions. Sweep east, then pivot north. Establish a blocking position. Engage aggressively. It was a language built for momentum and measurable results. A language that assumed the jungle would obediently reveal its secrets if you pressed hard enough. The Australians listened. Their commander, Brigadier O.D. Jackson, stood with his hands behind his back, expression neutral, eyes moving from map to colonel to map again. He nodded once or twice, not because he agreed, but because he'd been taught manners. 3 minutes, that's all he gave it. Then Jackson reached forward, gathered his own folded maps as if he were packing up after a meeting that had run overtime, nodded to his officers and turned toward the door. The colonel blinked, confused in the way only authority can be confused, like a hammer suddenly discovering a nail that refuses to be hit. "Brigadier," he called out, voice sharpening, "where do you think you're going? We haven't finished the operational briefing." Jackson stopped at the doorway and looked back. Not angry, not dramatic, just calm, like a man stating the weather. 3 words. "We don't comply." For a second, the room didn't process it. The fan kept turning. The lights kept humming. Somebody's pen stopped moving above a notebook because their brain had stalled. Wait, what? An Australian brigadier, commanding a force that was, on paper, a footnote compared to the American machine, had just walked out on a U.S. Army colonel who believed he had direct authority from MACV, the Supreme Allied Command Structure in Southeast Asia. You can't do that, except he did. And if you think that moment was just ego, just a cultural misunderstanding, just one stubborn officer trying to prove a point, then you don't understand what was about to happen in Phuoc Tuy Province. Because those 120 Australians weren't there to be absorbed into the American war. They were there to fight their own. And the operational autonomy they demanded, the methods they intended to use without American oversight, would produce results so effective and so controversial that Pentagon analysts would spend the next decade trying to understand how a force a fraction the size of a U.S. division could achieve outcomes American divisions could not. A classified assessment written years later by an intelligence officer who had served alongside them would try to explain it in a line that sounded like a compliment and an accusation at the same time. They fight wars we forgot how to. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why Viet Cong documents captured in 1969 carried a specific warning about the Australians, written in language that suggested something beyond ordinary respect, something closer to dread, because for the men in the jungle, it didn't feel like fighting a military, it felt like being hunted. If you want to understand why integration into US command was almost impossible, don't start with tactics. Start with memory. Start with Singapore. February 15th, 1942. The Gibraltar of the East, the supposedly impregnable fortress, the anchor of British power in the Pacific, it fell after a campaign that barely lasted 70 days, and the Australians who survived, those who marched into captivity, those who learned the rules of suffering at Changi, those who bled on the Burma Railway, those who watched friends die of disease and exhaustion and cruelty, came home carrying a lesson that burned hotter than metals. They hadn't lost because they were cowards. They hadn't lost because the Japanese were magic. They lost because they were commanded with doctrine built for the wrong world. European doctrine, European assumptions, European arrogance. In a jungle where those ideas didn't just fail, they killed you. That wasn't theory to Australians in 1966. That wasn't a lecture in a staff college. It was family history. It was the older sergeant who never talked about his hands because you could still see where the rope had cut. It was the officer who flinched at sudden sounds not because he was weak, but because his nervous system had been rewired in 1942 and never fully reset. It was the quiet, unspoken understanding that following someone else's plan, without the power to adapt it, was how you ended up in a trench that became your grave. So when Vietnam called for volunteers and Australia committed combat troops in 1965, Canberra faced a structural problem. Politically, Australia wanted to stand with the United States. They wanted American presence in the region. They wanted the alliance to mean something real. Militarily, the men who actually did the fighting, men shaped by Malaya, by Borneo, by long jungle patrols and patient counterinsurgency, had no intention of subordinating Australian forces to an American style of war they didn't trust. At first, they tried compromise. Australia sent the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, to serve as the 3rd Infantry Battalion of the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade near Bien Hoa, Australians under American command, integrated into American operations, American doctrine, American tempo, American noise. It lasted 9 months. 9 months before the reports began coming back, written in the careful, restrained language officers use when they're trying not to sound like they're accusing an ally of getting men killed. The problem wasn't that Americans were incompetent. In conventional war, open terrain, massed formations, clear targets, American doctrine worked brilliantly. overwhelming firepower, helicopters, mobility, speed. But Vietnam wasn't open terrain, and the enemy wasn't going to stand up in neat formations and be destroyed on schedule. Australian platoon commanders watched American units helicopter into an area with a roar you could hear for miles, then push through the jungle with 100 men, radios crackling, blades chopping, a whole operation broadcasting itself like a marching band. They watched those Americans establish positions that required constant resupply, then act surprised when the Viet Cong simply melted away, waited, and returned the moment the Americans left. To Australians trained in the Malayan emergency, where counterinsurgency was slow, intimate, information-driven, the American approach didn't look aggressive. It looked loud. And loud, in a jungle war, was often another word for blind. One Australian captain's after-action report, filed in late 1965, would later be quoted in Australian military colleges for decades because it captured the entire gap in a few sentences. American doctrine prioritizes speed and firepower. Malayan doctrine prioritizes patience and information. In jungle warfare, information is firepower. Americans arrive quickly and accomplish nothing. We arrive slowly and accomplish everything. By March 1966, Australia made a decision that would define their Vietnam War. They would deploy an independent task force, 2 battalions at first, later expanded to 3, with its own artillery, armor, aviation, and special operations support. But the key wasn't the numbers. The key was control. They would have their own tactical area of responsibility. They would operate under Australian command. They would coordinate with the Americans, but they would not be commanded by them. That distinction sounds like bureaucracy until you realize what it means in the field. Operational coordination meant the Australians would share intelligence, avoid friendly fire incidents, and not collide with American operations by accident. But it did not mean an American general could tell Australians how to patrol, when to patrol, what tactics to use, or what success should look like. They would fight their own war, their own way, in Phuoc Tuy Province. Even the choice of Phuoc Tuy was a statement. The Americans wanted the Australians near the Cambodian border. Heavy enemy activity, lots of contact, lots of chances to be pulled into big American operations that required big American support. The Australians politely declined. They wanted the coast. They wanted a province east of Saigon, accessible by sea for independent resupply, anchored by the port at Vung Tau, containing a provincial capital at Baria, and, most importantly, an area where they could apply their preferred counterinsurgency doctrine without interference. Phuoc Tuy was infested with Viet Cong. The D-445 Provincial Mobile Battalion operated out of the Long Hai Mountains and the Min Dam complex. Local force units controlled much of the countryside. Vung Tau might be relatively secure, but move 5 kilometers inland and you entered territory that hadn't seen reliable government control in years. Perfect. Difficult enough to justify resources, manageable enough for a brigade-sized force to impact, isolated enough to operate independently. And when the Australians negotiated command arrangements with American leadership, they laid down principles like steel. First, the Australian task force commander would have full tactical control within Phuoc Tuy. Americans could request help outside the province, but they couldn't order it. Second, Australians would not be required to adopt American doctrine, procedures, or reporting beyond minimum coordination. Third, Canberra, not MACV, would determine force levels, deployment schedules, and rules of engagement. If Washington wanted something, Washington had to convince Australia, not just issue an order down the chain. General Westmoreland agreed. Maybe he assumed the Australians would eventually conform once they felt the heat. Maybe he valued any Allied contribution. Maybe he didn't fully appreciate how different their intentions were. But the relationship that emerged was unique. The Australians at Nui Dat took orders only from Canberra. American generals could advise. They could not command. And that difference would matter more than any single weapon system. Nui Dat began to take shape in May and June of 1966, and the contrast with American bases was immediate. American installations often sprawled. Permanent structures, helicopter pads, massive artillery positions, supply dumps, thousands of troops, logistics prioritized, and security assumed to be something you could buy with size. The Australians built like men who assumed they would be attacked. Because in Malaya, isolated bases had to be defensible by the troops actually present. You didn't always have an airstrike on call. You didn't always have reinforcements. Sometimes the perimeter was the difference between living and disappearing. They cleared a wide radius. They moved local inhabitants away, not because they enjoyed it, but because they refused to be observed. They built interlocking fields of fire, minefields, wire obstacles, and patrol patterns that turned the base into something hard, compact, and dangerous. A place that didn't rely on outside help, a place that assumed the enemy was watching. Then the Australian SAS arrived, and that's when American observers began using words like reckless, insane, and when they were honest, how the hell are they doing that? The Australian Special Air Service Regiment was modeled on the British SAS, but adapted through Australian experience in Borneo and Malaya. In Vietnam, they became the task force's eyes and ears, and their methods scandalized Americans who saw warfare as something you managed through layers of support. SAS patrols went in with 5 men. 5. They would insert by helicopter into enemy-controlled territory and then operate for 2 to 3 weeks without resupply, without constant radio chatter, without artillery on standby, without the psychological comfort Americans considered mandatory. They moved through jungle so thick American units avoided it unless they were willing to cut it open. They established observation positions within meters of Viet Cong trails and watched enemy movement for days without being detected. And when they engaged, it wasn't to rack up numbers. It was to shape the enemy's mind. American long-range reconnaissance patrols often had a philosophy: get in, gather what you can, get out before you're swallowed. Australian SAS had a different one: get in, become invisible, stay, learn the rhythm of the jungle, and when you strike, make it count beyond the immediate dead. This wasn't recklessness, it was calculated risk backed by a selection and training process that didn't just test endurance, it selected for a specific kind of mind. Americans tended to emphasize speed, leadership, physical output. Australians emphasized patience, the ability to remain motionless for hours, the willingness to move like a shadow at glacial speed, the comfort with isolation, the ability to operate independently, knowing help might be days away. They weren't selecting men who could fight in the jungle, they were selecting men who could become part of it, and a significant portion of their training didn't come from manuals, it came from the Australian outback, learning tracking from Aboriginal instructors whose knowledge wasn't written down because it had been carried in people for tens of thousands of years. To Americans, tracking was often a skill you learned in a schoolhouse: signs, spoor, broken twigs, disturbed soil. To the Aboriginal trackers who joined SAS squadrons, tracking was something closer to reading language. They could see age in a footprint the way a baker reads dough. They could tell direction, load, speed, hesitation. They could pick up a trail where Americans saw nothing but green. They could sit in ambush and hear a bird change its call and know, without seeing or hearing the enemy, that movement was coming. In Vietnam, where the jungle erased evidence and the enemy survived by being unseen, that ability was a weapon Americans didn't have an equivalent for. At first, American liaison officers assumed the SAS were basically their own LRRP teams with different accents. Then came the mission that shattered that assumption. Americans requested SAS support for reconnaissance in a difficult sector. The American plan looked like every American plan: a 3-day patrol, helicopter insertion and extraction, continuous radio updates every 4 hours, pre-planned artillery support on call. The SAS patrol leader listened, then ignored almost all of it. They inserted by helicopter, then walked 12 kilometers away from the insertion point before even beginning their real work, specifically to defeat any enemy surveillance of landing zones. They kept radio silence except for one brief scheduled transmission each day. They stayed not 3 days, but 17. They didn't just locate the enemy right now. They mapped patterns, trail networks, traffic estimates, time windows, supply routes, meeting areas, cache sites, morale, habits, routines. The intelligence was extraordinary, and the Americans didn't know what to do with it, because American doctrine was built on finding the enemy and destroying him with firepower. Australian intelligence was built on understanding the enemy so thoroughly you could predict him. American commanders wanted coordinates so they could call in artillery tonight. Australians wanted to know where the enemy would walk next week so they could be waiting in silence when he arrived. That conceptual gap became friction as 1966 turned into 1967. American generals visited Phuoc Tuy and saw fewer big sweeps, fewer dramatic helicopter assaults, fewer contact reports. They concluded the Australians were inactive, not aggressive enough, not producing the right numbers. The most famous critique came from Westmoreland himself in January 1967. After observing Australian operations, he publicly described their approach as very inactive. To Americans, it was a mild comment. To Australians, it was a spark in gasoline. Brigadier Stuart Graham responded through official channels with a controlled anger that barely stayed inside the lines of military politeness. His task force had been operating continuously for months. They had achieved a kill ratio exceeding 10-to-1 while sustaining the lowest casualty rate of any comparable Allied force. And, most important, they had reduced enemy activity so dramatically that Viet Cong units were avoiding contact not because Australians were timid, but because the Viet Cong had learned that contact with Australians tended to end badly. Americans measured success through metrics: enemy killed, sorties flown, rounds fired, operations conducted. Australians, shaped by Malaya, measured success through changes in the environment: reduction in enemy incidents, extension of government control, improved security, degraded enemy morale. Those things didn't fit neatly into daily statistics. They emerged slowly, and they required patience. Then came Long Tan, August 1966. A patrol from D Company, 6 RAR, 108 men, walked into what should have been their end: a prepared ambush. An enemy force estimated at over 2,000, outnumbered 20-to-1, caught in open terrain among rubber trees as monsoon rain turned the world into gray sheets and noise into confusion. By American assumptions, that company should have been annihilated, but they weren't. They fought for hours. They called artillery so close it cut their own men. They held their ground until relief arrived with armored personnel carriers, then pushed forward and drove the enemy away. 18 Australians killed, 24 wounded, enemy dead counted in the hundreds, with more dragged away into the jungle. The battle showcased principles that were deeply Australian. Junior leaders made decisions without waiting for higher approval because they were trained to do so. Artillery coordination was practiced and precise because Australian doctrine assumed infantry would need it, and they trained that integration constantly. Marksmanship standards were higher because Australians assumed small small units might face larger forces, and every shot had to matter. And perhaps most importantly, the company didn't panic when surrounded because they had been mentally conditioned to fight through chaos, not collapse under it. Long Tan should have settled the argument. It didn't, because the argument wasn't about whether Australians could fight, it was about whether Americans could recognize a form of aggression that didn't sound like a chainsaw. American aggression was loud, Australian aggression was patient. Australian infantry patrolled constantly, small units moving quietly, invisible unless you were unlucky enough to be in their path. SAS patrols watched trails and camps, feeding intelligence that made ambushes feel inevitable. Artillery harassment was based on information, not noise, interrupting enemy movement instead of just burning through ammunition. By 1968, the differences hardened into institutional frustration. American commanders wanted Australians to conduct large operations outside Phuoc Tuy to support American campaigns. Australians argued that spreading their small force thin would reduce their effectiveness everywhere. American command wanted higher body count statistics. Australians argued body count was a meaningless metric that incentivized waste and measured the wrong thing in counterinsurgency. The breaking point came during the Tet Offensive. American command wanted Australians deployed outside their province for extended periods. Australians did deploy, fought effectively at Coral Balmoral against North Vietnamese regulars, then returned to Phuoc Tuy despite American requests to stay. Their position was simple. They had been given responsibility for Phuoc Tuy. They would fulfill that responsibility by pacifying Phuoc Tuy. If American generals wanted Australians elsewhere, they could take it up with Canberra, and that stance infuriated some American officers who saw it as an ally refusing to fully contribute. But it reflected Australian calculation. Their force was small. If diluted across multiple provinces, they'd achieve nothing significant anywhere. Concentrated in one, they could show what effective counterinsurgency looked like. Their record supported them. By 1969, enemy-initiated incidents in Phuoc Tuy dropped dramatically compared to 1966. Main force units were pushed out or reduced. Road security improved. Villages shifted from Viet Cong control to contested to government-influenced. This wasn't done with massive firepower. It was done with persistent pressure that gave the enemy no rest. Australian patrols were always out there, always watching, always ready. The SAS made the Viet Cong leadership uncertain about what was known, building paranoia that degraded decision-making. Then came Operation Marsden in 1969, the crown jewel of Australian operational success. Intelligence, much of it gathered by SAS patrols and trackers, identified a major Viet Cong supply cache and headquarters complex in the Minh Dam Mountains. An American approach might have been straightforward: bomb it, assault it hard, count the bodies. The Australians did something else. They sealed the routes quietly, they established observation positions, and then they waited. For weeks, they intercepted movement, captured prisoners, tightened the cordon, learned more with every day. Only when the shape of the enemy's response was clear did they strike. When they finally assaulted, they found weapons enough to equip 2 battalions, medical supplies for a field hospital, and documents that illuminated Viet Cong structure far beyond the province. It devastated D445's capability, and it was accomplished with minimal Australian casualties because it was built on intelligence, preparation, and restraint. And still, the American criticism continued. In 1969, a senior American commander visited and declared Phuoc Tuy a disaster because Australian body count statistics didn't meet his expectations. Never mind that enemy activity had plummeted, never mind that security had improved, never mind that the Australians were sustaining minimal casualties while degrading enemy capability. The metric demanded more dead. The Australians responded diplomatically in official channels and brutally in private letters. One officer wrote something that would be quoted for decades after the war. American generals want to win Vietnam by killing every Vietnamese. We want to win by convincing the Vietnamese that the government side offers better security than the communist side. These strategies are not compatible. That disagreement was never resolved. The Australians kept operating their way. The Americans kept wanting them to operate differently, professionally functional, strategically divergent. And then there was the part Americans truly struggled to understand: the psychological warfare. The Australians didn't just want the enemy dead, they wanted the enemy uneasy. They staged scenes meant to whisper a message into the jungle, a body positioned not to brag, but to suggest silent death, a camp discovered and rearranged without anyone being killed, just to prove we were here and you didn't know. Small signs left behind that exploited superstition, fear, and rumor. Not because Australians were cruel for sport, but because they understood something older than doctrine. In a guerrilla war, the mind is terrain. If you can make the enemy feel watched, you degrade him without firing a shot. American culture preferred straightforward force, overwhelming firepower, clear engagements. The idea of manipulating fear, of leaning into the invisible, made many Americans uncomfortable, like it belonged to spies rather than soldiers. For Australians, it was integrated. Every contact was a message. Captured communist documents reflected the effect. Reports described Australian patrols moving silently, appearing without warning, striking from ambush, vanishing before reinforcements arrived. Some described Australians as jungle ghosts, and more than one report suggested something almost humiliating. Some Viet Cong preferred preferred facing Americans. Because Americans were predictable, Americans came hard, then left. Australians stayed, and when the enemy tried to return to normal afterward, there was no afterward. The hunters were still there. In American sectors, communist units often withdrew under pressure and returned when the Americans moved on. In Australian sectors, communist units avoided contact because Australians didn't clear and leave. They remained, they patrolled, they waited. A captured operations order from a North Vietnamese unit put it plainly: when fighting the Americans, we select advantageous ground and withdraw when conditions are unfavorable. When fighting the Australians, we avoid contact if possible. They are patient hunters who do not clear areas and leave. They remain indefinitely, making long-term operations impossible. That was the strategic success of Australian independence, not terror of firepower, which can be avoided, but fear of persistence, which cannot. That success came at a cost to the men living it. Australian soldiers served 12-month tours in an environment where they were constantly in the field, constantly on patrol, constantly at risk. Unlike many American formations with large rear areas and support structures, the Australian task force was mostly combat troops. If you deployed to Phuoc Tuy, you spent most of your year in the jungle or on a defensive line. No air-conditioned office refuge, no long stretch of safety, just a rhythm of tension that never fully released. The casualty statistics didn't show it in battle losses. They remained low compared to many others, but later, in the years after, it would show in something harder to quantify: trauma, the slow burn of stress, the weight of a war fought at close range, at low noise, at high consequence. And still, during the war itself, the method produced results. The Australians achieved the highest kill ratio of any Allied force in Vietnam, not because they were more aggressive, but because they were more selective. They did not fight because someone demanded a number. They fought because the fight fit the plan. They built operations on intelligence, preparation, and advantage. They refused to be bullied into missions that didn't match their capabilities. They accepted limitations: fewer helicopters, less guaranteed support, and planned accordingly. They didn't build their war around assets they couldn't depend on. They built it around what they could sustain. That was the heart of it. Operational independence wasn't a prideful refusal to play nice. It was strategic clarity. The Australians knew how they needed to fight. They knew what wouldn't work. They knew integration into an American command structure would grind their method into dust and replace it with something louder, faster, and, within their force size, deadlier to themselves. So they refused. They coordinated. They cooperated. But they did not comply. When Australian forces began withdrawing in 1970, part of broader Allied disengagement, they left behind a province that, during their presence, had been more secure than many comparable American sectors. Enemy activity remained low, government presence held, infrastructure functioned. It wasn't perfect. Viet Cong political networks didn't evaporate, and after the Australians were gone, communist forces could return in strength. But for the years they operated their way, under their own command, they achieved what the war claimed to want: population security and reduced enemy capability. They achieved it not by following American orders, but by refusing orders that would compromise effectiveness. Years later, after the reports were written, after the arguments faded into academic debates, American military colleges would study Australian operations as examples of effective counterinsurgency. The very operations once criticized as inactive became case studies. The very independence American commanders found frustrating became recognized as wisdom. And it all traced back to that room in Long Binh, that fan pushing hot air, that colonel pointing at a map as if a line drawn in grease pencil could tame a jungle. 3 words that sounded like insubordination until you understood the history behind them. We don't comply, not because Australians didn't respect allies, but because they respected reality more. They came to Vietnam to fight, but they came to fight smart. And 120 men who walked out of a briefing room proved something that war planners hate to admit. Sometimes the smallest force can create the biggest impact, if it has the courage to refuse the wrong plan, even when the wrong plan comes from the most powerful ally on Earth. In the dense, difficult history of Vietnam, that might be Australia's most important contribution. Not the battles alone, not the body counts, not even the legends of jungle ghosts, but the proof that there was another way if you had the independence to pursue it.